Right, apologies everyone, just to get started again. So thank you all for joining us today as we discuss this very important topic of how we best keep children in mind and in view in our service system responses. My name's Anna and I'll be hosting the session. Just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of Aboriginal people today. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the past, present and emerging traditional custodians and elders of this country on which we work. For me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and others are likely on different Aboriginal lands across Victoria and even further afield. I'd also like to acknowledge the injustices and trauma suffered as a result of European settlement, the stolen generations, and other policies such as the forced removal of children from their families, communities, culture and land. We respect the resilience of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in the face of this trauma and respect their right to an aspiration for self-determination and empowerment. And so again, thank you for joining us today. This is the first in a three-part webinar series that will explore approaches to engagement and assessment of children and young people, and encourage service providers to think about how we best keep children in mind and in view. The webinar series is part of the Child Wellbeing Project at the Centre for Excellence that has been a partnership between the Centre and Family Safety Victoria. So I'm thrilled today to be joined by Dr. Wendy Bunston and Gayle Webber. Thank you, Wendy and Gayle. Really looking forward to hearing from you today. So Dr. Wendy Bunston is an international author, presenter, researcher and clinician, specialising in working therapeutically with infants and their families impacted by family violence. Wendy's PhD on the experience of infants in women's refuges won the distinguished Nancy Millis Award in 2016 and was a finalist in the highly prestigious 2019 Victorian Premier's Health and Medical Research Award. Wendy also has some books, which I'm sure would be highly valuable to read, Helping Babies and Children to Heal After Family Violence and Supporting Vulnerable Babies and Young Children. And introducing Gayle. Gayle Webber is the Child and Young Person Practice Lead at the Orange Door Ovens Murray, where she is bringing the infant and child into the forefront of our thinking and practice when addressing family violence, abuse and neglect. Gayle has worked in the youth sector for 8 years and in the family violence space for the past 2 years. Gayle has a passion for infant mental health and collaborative practice. So just a couple of technical matters. There'll be a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So yeah, it'd be great to type your questions into the Q&A box as the webinar progresses, and we'll have about 15 minutes or so at the end to work through those. If you are having any technical issues, we recommend leaving and rejoining the webinar, the Zoom link, as this often resolves the issue, and the session is being recorded. The recording of the webinar, along with links to further resources, will be emailed to all registered attendees after the session. Great, just going to stop sharing my screen now so we can get started. So again, thank you so much for joining me today, Wendy and Gayle. And to get us started, maybe we can talk about, what we mean when we're talking about engagement with infants and young children. What are we banging on here?
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Anna, and thanks everyone for having us. I would also like to pay respect to the Aboriginal land that we're on currently and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Thank you. I mean, when we're talking about engaging infants and young children, I do think, first and foremost, we're thinking about creating the safety for parents in the space as well. So we're, offering a cup of tea, offering water to help make sure the parents are comfortable as well before we, start to engage with the infant and child. And it's really like we really get on their level. We watch and let the child or the infant take the lead in those interactions as well. That's how I would start that. How would you?
Well, I would I do see infants and young children no different to any other age group that we engage with. And we offer infants and children the same courtesies that we offer the adults and young people we work with, which is through working very hard to make people feel comfortable when we first meet them, to be able to be a reassuring presence, to be able to remember what their name is, to be able to have some capacity to talk to them about if there's been a referral, if there's been some sort of previous contact, that we are on top of that and we know what's going on, and that we're talking to the infant as well, that we're being able to involve the infant in the engagement process. We look at the infant, we speak to the infant. We're not inappropriate in terms of how we physically engage with the infant, which can be something that sometimes people presume that we have the right to go up and go, oh, what a beautiful baby, and to touch the infant and do all those sorts of things. Our job is not to do anything with the infant that we would, not do with a parent, not do with a young person. That it is a slow, cautious, gentle process of being able to make people feel comfortable in our space and for them to feel like we're a comfortable, safe person. Infants are no different. Infants are very attuned to the tone of our voice, our facial expressions, how we hold our body in the space, all those sorts of things that we probably are more conscious of when we are working with adults and young people. And for some reason, it's sort of like we sort of disappear from our mind that infants and children are just as attuned, just as curious, just as eager to watch us and decipher whether we're safe people or not. So I think it's a false divide where we think the younger they are, the more we maybe get freaked and think, oh, what do I do? I think we do the same as we do with anyone else, just offer that common level of courtesy and respect.
And, I think that also...
I have a dog wanting to get up. That's why I'm twisting around.
We love our dogs, yeah. I'd also just add that, it's about those basics and explaining why they're here today, what confidentiality means, what the purpose of our yarn and our chat is, and what we want to do together. Because it might be that we've got some worries, or there's school that's got worries, or your parents have got worries, and we're here to talk about those today, and keeping it really simple and grounded and safe for both the parent and the infant and young child, because if we can role model that opportunity for the parent to have a conversation about what's going on with the infant and child, it helps build that safety outside of the room as well, which is really important.
And maybe just building on what Gayle said, it's also that capacity to invite the parent to think about what the infant might be experiencing as they're meeting new people in a new space, and maybe in a space where there's a heightened level of anxiety because they're coming in to get access to services and support, and the parent might be feeling very anxious or very judged or all sorts of things. Something we can do that's very effective is to be able to be curious with the parent and ask them, how do you think your little one's making sense of where they are at the moment? If your little one could tell me what their experience has been the last week and what it is that's brought you here, what would they tell me? What would they tell me about what it's been like for their mummy? So there's all sorts of things that you can do to very powerfully bring the infant into the space. And this is Coco, by the way.
Hi, Coco.
Just so you know. And Coco may have some things to say later on. I don't know. I mean, it's just it's unpredictable. I don't know what she'll have to say, but yeah.
And even questions to the parents around, what can I do right now to make Charlie feel safe, or what can we do to have a bit of fun together? What is he or she or they like doing? And let's do some of that here to make sure that we're not just here about the serious stuff. Like, it's okay to have a bit of fun and have a play and have a giggle too. It's not always doom and gloom. Like, it's important to get to know them and engage with them as humans.
Thank you both. And I mean, touching on that a bit further, Gayle, with what you've just mentioned, what sort of strategies or approaches can practitioners use to engage with, infants and young children? What is the best way of going about that? We won't be able to sort of start asking them questions, or they may not, have the words to answer. So what would be some ways of going about that?
Yeah, it does really depend on their age, right? But really, it's great to have anything from age-appropriate toys, fiddle toys or sensory toys, to even having like a doll house if they're 3 or 4 or 5. That's a really playful way to ask questions around who, and you might have images of different adult figures or different other children, and ask some curious questions through the play, or invite some drawing and get them to draw what makes them feel scared or what makes them feel happy, or drawing a picture of their family. So using what they can relate to, and then afterwards taking the time to reflect and think about what that might actually mean, or how do we make sense of what they've told us, through their play or through their drawing. That's often what I'll do. Yeah.
Infant observation, which is a huge sort of plank in infant mental health practice and in infant mental health training, invites us to be really curious about what we see in the infant, and we can get caught up with paperwork, we can get caught up with what it is that we've been told is the information we need to collect. But if you are taking an infant mental health perspective in your work, you are very curious about what you see and what you feel in the presence of the infant. So the infant can give a lot of information about how they're managing things by the way that they seek out and engage with their caregiver and or siblings. It might be that through the course of the session, you notice that the infant is a bit jumpy. So there might be noises that happen, the little one startles, and you sort of see that in front of you, and you can be curious about that with the mum or whoever the caregiver is. You can be curious about, I just saw little Frankie jump almost out of your arms when that noise happened. What do you think that meant for Frankie? And have there been other occasions where Frankie gets startled really easily? That can lead into discussions about what's Frankie's life been like for the last week or 2 months or 3 months. So using what you see in the presence of the infant, the way the infant uses their mother to get comfort or doesn't use their mother to get comfort, the way they engage with their siblings, how the siblings interact with the little one. There's all manner of things that will happen in front of you that often we can be blind to because we're busy in our head focusing on question, answer, and you're not seeing what's happening in front of you, which is you might have an infant who's quite dysregulated, or you might see an infant who's dissociative. So there's just nothing much happening there. And infants are hardwired to engage with their environment. So if you've got a little baby who's being too compliant and being too well behaved and too quiet, that's something to be curious about. Whether you bring it into the session or not is another matter, because you have to make a judgment about, is this the time to do that? But as a practitioner, you can be curious about that and wonder, why is this baby so quiet? Maybe there's got siblings around them that are being incredibly noisy and intrusive. So sometimes I've certainly noticed in lots of settings where little ones, the toddlers or the older kids, can come in and be really quite invasive of the infant space, can be very unaware of the gentleness you need to have with babies, and can do all sorts of things that really you're sitting there and you're thinking, oh crap, that's whoa, what hello, we've got another dog down here needing a pat.
Oh, okay, sorry, I'm so rude.
You're allowed to. We have some home duties here. So Tilly might need a pat there. Okay, yes. Right, so Tilly's the blind one who's down here. Doesn't want to come up. Yeah. Although she might come up if you. Okay. Anyway. All right. So this is what we're just showing you. What you have to do in this space is when you've got another being who's saying, please take notice of me and please acknowledge I'm here. It's our job to acknowledge that they're here, and not to be blinded by this adult-centric idea we have of the client is mum and that's it. The client is the infant, it's the young child, it's the adolescent, it's the mum, it's the whole package. And the reality is that most mums come in because of their children. I think, generally speaking, in my practice and in my research, it's been that the infant and child is a motivation for coming in to get help, something they wouldn't have done for themselves.
And I think that it's really important that we move away from relying so heavily on parents to share what's happening in the home or happening at school or happening in kinder, that because we don't know the full picture if we're not able to sit down and connect with, the little one themselves, for them to share their experience or be able to share what's going on from their perspective. Because I've also met really assertive 4-year-olds that'll tell me exactly what is happening and what they're wanting, and it doesn't always line up with them, which is great. It's great that we're able to hear and learn from them what they're wanting. I also would just add another element that, back to that newborn sort of observation that we're talking about with an infant, how we can learn that every infant or newborn is different from the next, and the way that they might respond to their name being called, or a parent's voice, a carer's voice, versus us saying their name. Like, all of those minor or smaller details build this picture of connection and build this picture of who they are, whether they can respond, if they respond differently to an object, and moving that, from across their eyes, from left to right, versus, that voice, or the noise response. Like, it really tells us so much.
Thank you, Gayle. That's such a valuable point around every, infant and young child being different from the next. And whilst we can have an understanding of developmentally sort of expected behaviour, it's going to vary a great deal, isn't it?
Yeah. And, that's right. When we're thinking about temperaments, personalities, behaviours, emotions, like every little one experiences that differently in the household even. So, capturing each voice is important.
Do you have sort of examples of that, Wendy, where, thinking about sort of how, much difference there can be in the presentations of?
Yes. I guess there's the sort of generic answer to that, which is the nuances of how infants present is particular to them. And one of the things that perhaps we're not so conscious of is the fact that the emotional repertoire that an infant is born with stays the same for the rest of our life. If you really observe an infant, they've got quite profound and exquisitely diverse ways of expressing their emotional world, but they can't at that stage in their life do that through language and through cognition, because those things haven't come online yet. But our emotional range and our sensory capacities are there from the beginning. What we grow into is our ability to give words to give cognition and to give expression to those vast array of emotional expressions. So if we allow ourselves as observers of the infant to be emotionally touched by what it feels like to be in the presence of certain infants and available to be curious about the range of emotional affect and expression that the infant shows us, then we can bring that very powerfully into the space. So there's a lady called Beebe's the surname. I can't remember the first name, who's done lots of video research in terms of the macro and the micro expressions of infants. So when you sort of slow things down, you see this quite extraordinary range of emotional expression in infants. And adults sometimes just imagine that that can't be possible, so we don't look for it and we don't allow ourselves to be emotionally touched by it. So it's really about us changing and us seeing things that are already in front of us but have precluded the possibility that they could be there because they're babies. So what would babies know? What can babies tell us? Well, they can tell us an enormous amount. So that's just as a general proposition. Then specifically thinking about, okay, here are a cohort of little ones who we can expect have some effects of being exposed to familial violence, either by being directly there when those things happen, because babies are more likely to be present, because they're more likely to be, in close proximity to the caregiver. Some of the things that we see is a more blunted presentation of those diverse capacities for emotional affect. So by that I mean, if you have had to defend yourself against scary, traumatic things, you're more likely to be dissociative. So there's more likely to be a blunting in the affect. So not as engaged, not as curious. Maybe the way they hold themselves in their body can be overly rigid or can be overly floppy. So we're looking at the presentation sometimes sitting more within the furthest sort of lines of the what is in the middle sort of presentation of infants, where they can be very alert, they can be very curious, they can do lots of smiling, they can do lots of cueing into people. These infants may not have such a diverse range of emotional expression because they've had to defend themselves against very enormous things that babies are not equipped to defend themselves with. So they can move into a dysregulated state fairly quickly, or they can move to a state where they are like the perfect baby because they don't make any protest. Babies protest. Babies tell you when they're cold. They tell you when they're hungry. They tell you when they're tired. Babies that don't do that, you would probably start to have question marks in your mind and thinking, what's not letting this little one tell us how they're feeling? And that's the sort of range that I think gets shrunken, compressed, defeated by having to protect yourself from things that are too big to protect yourself from, so you shut down. Or you're hypervigilant. But hypervigilance tends to be a capacity you show as you get a little bit older, as opposed to when you're a baby. Because a baby cannot run and hide from things. A baby cannot get to the telephone and say, I need help. The baby cannot take themselves to the next door neighbour. The baby's stuck there in the middle of it. And if nobody comes when they protest, when they cry, when they say, I'm not coping, this is scaring me, then they have no choice but eventually to shut down. And the more they have that experience, the more their default position will be shut down. And if we don't get in and do this work early, then we're going to have infants who grow into young children, who grow into young people, who grow into adults, whose default position, when they are triggered, will be shut down. And I think as a sector, we all know that's not a great way to respond when you're upset, traumatized, anxious, whatever, but it becomes the overriding thing that you do when you feel scared or misunderstood or judged or whatever else. So we want to change that if we can. I say, as I eat a banana chip and hand over to Gayle.
It's important you keep your nutrition's up.
Yeah, I'm beginning to fade. Yeah.
I would touch on 2 points, and I'd say that a lot of it, the first point that Wendy was talking about, tuning into the feeling state when we're in the room with a newborn or an infant. it really relies heavily on our own emotional intelligence as practitioners. Like, we need to be able to identify disappointment, joy, frustration, you know, those elaborative emotions that can be tricky for adults, to be able to witness that and wonder about that with an infant. So it's always really good to do your own work in that space as well, to be a stronger practitioner with little ones. And I think I think that really helps understand those micro expressions, or walk away feeling confused or just stressed, even whatever that is in our stomachs. You know, go look at a wheel chart, like a feelings chart, and go, what is this feeling that has come from nowhere? To help unpack that is really helpful, because it builds that curiosity of the infant's experience as well. But again, like the second point that I will just touch on is it comes down to, it might be a bit cliche, but the watch, wait and wonder principles of when we're working with them. So doing less is always more, just being present, being curious, and not necessarily have to do too much, because they'll show us naturally who they are and what they want. And
Thank you both. And we've sort of moved into the next question. Wendy, you started to touch on that. And would there be anything you would add around possible indicators of trauma and disrupted attachment in this age cohort that would be important to keep a lookout for?
I think it's anything in the extremities, and one always needs to be cautious, because you can jump. We tend to like to have this security of, if this happens and this happens and this happens, this must mean that. The work with infants is the work that I think should be applied across the lifespan, but it is our ability to sit in a space of not knowing. It's our ability to sit within a space of curiosity, and that the infant may be presenting in ways that are disconcerting. I can think of a young baby who was sitting on the lap of a mum when we were concerned about, this is in a family I worked with some time ago, and we're concerned more about the older boy, but this little baby was sitting in mum's lap and just flopping around. Like, I felt like this baby's going to slide off mum's lap at any point. And when you have something like that happen, I think it's telling you something, which is that this baby is not being contained in this space. And there were actually a couple of times when I leant forward because I thought this baby was going to fall off mum's lap. This was while mum was telling me how much she in some ways actually considered that her pre-teenage child was sort of beyond hope, and she was putting all her energy now into this baby. And I could see a baby that had very little energy in them, very little being held by their mother. And, there was obviously a whole raft of issues going on in the family and the life of this person, and intergenerationally, all sorts of things. But I guess when you're being infant and child-led in your practice, your bottom line is this little one being supported the way that they need to be able to grow? And if that isn't happening, how do I bring attention to that, and how do I work with that in a way which is imbuing hope, not just in the parent, but in the baby? So for me, any sort of extremity of behaviour, if they're failure to thrive, if they're being fed multiple bottles and being not responded to, that there's a range of things that might be happening for them, but when they're crying, I will feed them. When they're cold, I will feed them. When they fuss, I will feed them. Anything that's at the extremity, you need to be curious about and wonder about what's the purpose of that. A child that's too well behaved, a child that's never well behaved. And I'm saying child, I mean infant, because a lot of projections can happen onto infants about how they're meant to be behaving and what they're meant to be doing. You're a baby, you're not meant to be doing anything but, getting fed, getting held, being looked at with love, being kept warm, having your needs met emotionally, and being enjoyed and being in a space that's helping you thrive. When those ingredients aren't there, you've got to wonder what's happening. And what we know from the research is that little ones exposed to family violence are not going to necessarily demonstrate developmental delays, or that there are things that aren't happening for them, until they sort of hit the 2 to 3 age group. And by the time they get to primary school, there is quite a lot of research that demonstrates that they are significantly behind their peers. But that does not necessarily show itself right at the beginning. So we as practitioners need to be aware and alert to some of those things and be more connected with the nuances. As Gayle was saying, their newborn observation stuff, it's being able to observe their competencies, it's being able to observe where there's things that don't seem just to be working, like they're almost sort of got their streamers and going, hey, look at me, look at me, look at me, and no one's looking at them. And you can see a baby's working incredibly hard to get noticed and nobody's noticing them. You take note of that in yourself as a practitioner, and it doesn't mean you have to do anything in the here and now with it, but you just collect some information that's like saying, there's some things here that don't feel right. And as practitioners, we're very left brain. We sort of talk about at an intellectual level these sort of hypotheses and formulas about what should be whatever. When you come away from a baby and you feel a level of vulnerability, or you feel a level of this just doesn't feel safe, take notice of that. Because what's being exchanged in that space is what the baby feels is engaging with what you feel. And at that sort of primitive intersubjective level, something is being conveyed to you. There is a communication that's being made to you at a non-verbal level, which is how the baby operates. And we too often dismiss that, ignore that. There's something very important being conveyed to us, and we should sit with that and be curious about that and explore that.
Yeah, I too have memories coming up with clients where that's, you feel like, for me as a practitioner, my intuition and the feeling sense is really what I lead my practice by. A lot of what we see at the Orange Door is changes in behaviour. So, they're usually really noisy, fussy, really difficult, but now they're not sleeping or not eating, or there's just a disruption or a change somewhere along the line, which parents or carers or schools are really, or kinders, daycares, really good at picking up on and sharing that information. And I think for me, when we're thinking about disrupted attachment, I'm really looking into the carers' language and how they're explaining or talking to or the infant or myself around what's happening, what the infant's like, how they see the infant. Maybe it's all the infant's fault, or they don't, in the extreme ends, it's like, I don't like this infant, or I don't like my life, or I don't like that they're the problem and it's their fault. That's sort of giving me hints something's happening in the relationship there that I'm curious about or worried about, which is important to reflect back and talk about without the judgment, without blame, and being there in that shared goal of how can we help you, enjoy one another and take pleasure, or all those sorts of things in the attachment relationship. Yeah.
Thank you both. And we know how vitally important the attachment relationship is for infants and young children for their well-being. And like you mentioned the word thrive or thriving, Wendy. And on that, what are the key aspects of well-being that are important to focus on in assessment of infants and young children?
I think the capacity for the parent to bring alive the mind of the infant. So the parent who can articulate that my baby gets upset when I feel tension in the house, or I notice this about my baby, or I notice that about my baby. The capacity to put yourself in the shoe or the booties of your baby speaks to a ability to really think about what's life like for my infant. So a parent who's able to do that, a parent who's able to say, I've been staying in this relationship because I love my partner, but I can see that my baby's not coping with this. I can see that my baby's frightened. That speaks to the capacity to really be motivated for change. And I think those sort of strengths are enormously valuable to capture and to give back, not in the traditional sense of, oh, okay, so this is the good reason to leave a violent partner, but in the sense of, are you wanting something different for your baby's future than what you've got at the moment? And through perhaps exploring their own history, that maybe they've come, and often is the case, they've come from our history of family violence themselves, and being able to use future and present orientated questions and reflections that suggest that, what did you want from your mum and dad when you were little and you were having these things happen? What do you wish they'd been able to do for you? Are you able to do that for yourself and for your baby? So I think that's a really important leverage point to sort of think about, how do you capture those things? Because we work in an area that's a bit like you said before, doom and gloom. It's like it's really just weighed down with intergenerational trauma, abuse, neglect, all sorts of things. It's a very heavy area to work in. But what babies bring to the occasion, what little ones bring to the occasion, is hope. They bring capacity for rapid repair, and no more than any other time in infancy can we have as much rapid repair, largely because it's the time which there's so much developmental growth happening at such a rapid pace. So remind me of your question again, because I do go off tangent, as you've probably been aware.
Are you waffling?
I'm waffling. What was the question again? And I may need to go and get, oh no, I've got some water here. Yeah.
I like tangents. You always get useful information when you go on a tangent. Just thinking about, yes, key aspects of wellbeing that are important to focus on in assessment within this age cohort. So I guess
it'd be really good if you had access to maternal child health assessment too, because there can be lots of things that at a physical level that we may not be so spot on with in terms of weight and percentile and all that sort of stuff, which is pretty important, because when a baby's underweight or a baby is unwell, they can very quickly deteriorate. So it's a very vulnerable age. So we need to not just think with our heads, we also need to be aware at a physiological level, how is this little one going? And most families have had access to a maternal child health nurse, particularly in Victoria where it's mandatory. So really there's that combination of being able to look at a baby and have a sense of, is this baby actually underweight or is this baby overweight? Is this baby, when latching to the breast, are they getting, nutrition and feeding out of that? What, things like, and we've both probably come across this, sometimes mums who have very little idea of what's appropriate for a baby, and they can be, and I'm not trying to be judgmental here, but sometimes can be giving their baby Diet Coke and different things within the first year of their life, and all sorts of things that really are not going to be great for that baby's development, but don't know that that's not a great thing to do for their development. So there's the level of accountability around the psychological and emotional safety of the infant, and being able to tick those boxes and have a sense of that, yes, this parent is appropriate. Yes, this parent reads their baby's cues. Yes, there is a capacity to comfort and provide safety for this infant when they're distressed. And then there's the physical stuff, and my baby's just coming.
She's in that. She doesn't want you.
Here we go.
I can keep going.
There we go. Yes.
So, I mean, in summary of
all those
Wendy's
points
saying,
that Wendy's saying,
is really talking about the relationship. So you're looking at what's happening in the relationship and how well they're understanding one another. The physical health and maternal child health are key work when we're talking about infants and little ones. They're really important to us. But I think from my perspective at the Orange Door, again, you're looking at the psychosocial factors, which you do a lot of talking through the parents of what might be impacting them on a day-to-day basis as well, in that broader system, thinking around what influences their well-being. And then you've got that smaller level, the micro level info too, which Wendy had mentioned. Yeah.
Which is probably scaring the bejeebers out of everyone. It's like we're not trained to do all that stuff. You don't have to be trained to do all that stuff. It's good if you get your head around it, but there are other people out there that carry that job. So you talk to them.
And while we're talking about like if all this information is overwhelming, I guess like my key message would be the power is in being curious and not needing to actually be the expert. Like infants are experts, parents are the experts. We're here to try and make sense of what's happening and you know, keep going with the support, whether it's, you know, family services or if it's you know, therapy, counselling.
And if you don't engage, you can forget all of that, because if you don't make that person feel safe and heard from the very first session, forget all of it, because they won't come back. And if we are engaging with the infant, we can also sometimes bring something very pleasurable and different into the space, because we're affording that infant the courtesy of being involved in it in a way that mum may never have seen anyone do before. And she may walk away from that contact a little bit more aware of the aliveness of her baby. So engagement, whatever age, is that we leave all the gimmicks at the door. We leave our notepad with all our questions at the door. And our very first job is to be safe and to be someone that person feels hears them and trusts them, and they actually come back.
Yeah, that's so vitally important. And we've started touching on, I guess, talking to other services, maternal child health, and also some of the questions you might be asking parents around what's going on for their infant or young child. But what would you add around questions that we could be asking of parents and of other services in the child's world when we're gathering information to understand their well-being?
I guess an example of this, like a case, might be helpful to try and synthesize some of this info. But a lot of the time we work with crisis, and lots of families presenting crisis, and they need housing, or they need brokerage, or they need their immediate needs met, which is often very adult centric. And they're moving towns, they're moving because of family violence or whatever it is, but the children are non-existent in those conversations. They're not we are so caught up in those immediate needs of trying to resolve the crisis as it is. But what about, the child's infant's routines are disrupted, meal times are unpredictable, they're in a foreign environment, their whole being in someone's mind is just not there in those moments. So our role really is to be curious and bring lines of questions in when we're speaking with parents around what's happening and what they're needing there and then. Can we get any toys organised, or do you need bedding, or what do they like playing with, or how can we support, Zach, Charlie, whoever in this time of crisis. I think really just bringing it back to the child time and time again really helps my practice anyway, because they're the reason that we're doing this for too, like when we're supporting families, parents in times of need. What would you say, Wendy?
I would say I'm writing down some questions, and for me, it's sometimes, working on that adult-centric challenging the adult-centric idea here is often when I do reflective supervision with people and I have a case presented, so usually because of my social work background, amongst other things, I really like a genogram. I will get a real clarity around the age and name of the mother. I'll get a lack of clarity around dad's name if it's a heterosexual couple. And sometimes people struggle to know the names of the children and their ages. So for me, it's really countering that mentality, and I really like starting at the beginning point with the infant and the children and what their experiences are. I think it's really important for those children that when we speak about their caregiver, whether it's the father, whether it's the same-sex partner's name, whoever that is, who's the other carer, that you actually know their name, and that for the sake of those children, you use their name rather than talking about the perpetrator, because for those little ones, they have an attachment to that person, which for better or for worse, whether we like it or whether we don't, might be a powerful attachment. So to be conscious of when we speak in front of children about their other parent, that we speak in a way that's respectful for those children, and that we ask the parent if your infant or child could tell me what they would want from you coming to see our service, not what you would want, but what they would want. What would they tell us? And if you have a child who's old enough to convey that to you, you ask them the question. You say, if you could have something different in your life at the moment than what's happening at the moment, what were the things that you would like? What would make you feel safe? What would make you feel okay? What would you like support with? Just that basic courtesy of bringing the infant and child into the space, knowing their name, using their name, being curious about what they may be experiencing, inviting the parent to bring that little one alive in their mind is a very powerful way of working.
Yeah, so, you know, like even in your case notes and your admin, like using names, even often they're then tacked on at the end, or that there's 3 children in the home. It's like, well, let's put the children's names front and center at the start of this sentence, and then the parents' names. Like, I think it's a whole sort of reshifting of the work, that they're not an add-on, that they're actually reflected in our systems, that they're front and center.
Because we wouldn't be doing this work. For most of us, the percentage of us doing this work is because they're infants, children, and young people. Not everyone, but for a lot of programs, it's because of the children that we have the funding and the things there in the first place. So why the hell aren't we actually actively seeing them as one of our stakeholders? That confounds me. And if we get in and do the work early and we do it well, we will be reducing the number of times that women will come into refuge. We'll be reducing the number of issues around developmental delay, around academic difficulty. So much would be achieved if we put much more energy into this space.
Similar along the lines of, you know, disempowering infants, children, you know, we can do that so accidentally or unconscious through our big systems. So if we can provide, you know, even that one-off opportunity to give them a sense of control, a sense of ownership, a sense of choice, when so much of their day-to-day is not any of that, because they can be so impacted by their environment, that's really powerful. And again, that's, you know, an opportunity for repair, role modeling, advocacy, that these small steps or these small gestures can have really profound impacts. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. Keeping an eye on the time, I know there's so much we could unpack and talk about on this topic. And, you know, I think you touched on something so important, Gayle, because you gave an example of where there might be, say, 3 children in the family, and naming each of them separately and considering their individual and unique sort of differences and needs is something really really vital too, I think. We might just move into a question. So please, if anyone has any questions, pop them into the Q&A box now before we finish up. We've just got under 10 minutes remaining of this session. So we've got a question here, which I'm going to read out, and it's no question is too long or short. So the question is, thank you so much, Wendy and Gayle. I'm a third-year Bachelor of Social Work student and I'm doing my honours next year. From my own lived experience, short and long-term impacts on children are often overlooked after having been exposed to family violence. As a parent who is managing my own recovery as a family violence survivor, the additional challenges of supporting my children through their own recovery has never been mentioned to me by support services, and I have had to navigate and research this myself. Whilst I'm still in the early stages of mapping out my honours proposal, I wish to focus my research on children as victim survivors of family violence in their own right, short and long-term impacts of exposure to family violence. So the question essentially is there any advice you might have as an emerging critical social worker from a research and practice perspective wishing to engage in this area?
I would first and foremost, and as someone I did my PhD looking at infants who went into refuge with their mums following family violence, first and foremost involve the voice of children. What I found when I was doing my literature review was how many research projects out there were dependent on what mothers said about their children, and they did not ask children what they thought about their own experience. So I think it's privileging the voice of infants and children in any shape or way that you can. And I did infant observation as part of my research. So I went into 8 refuges across Scotland, England, and across Australia. And I observed the infants and tried to do that before I actually talked to the mums and then talked to the refuge staff. So for me, it was like writing up infant observation was a way of presenting how these babies were in that space, and it was very powerful because there were lots of very emotional, very complex presentations. So I think if we carve out space really to privilege the voice of infants and children and have that as our beginning point in research, and then everything else comes from that, that's a very different way of doing research, very different, because most research is either asking the adult what they think or it privileges their voice over the children's voice. Me, turn it around.
And I think that it is a privilege for us to hear this, but they're also they're entitled to be telling us this. They're even more so important than the parents in many, many, many cases. So how do we make that a large system change? I think it's really powerful to hear your story around that's happening. So it's just so important that you do that research, really, that we share it and keep going, be advocates in the system around reshifting, pivoting the focus time and time again with the families that we're working with.
Yeah. Thank you very much. If anyone has any final questions before we finish up, please type them into the Q&A box now. Otherwise, we'll just move towards closing. So, just touching...
I'd just like to add then, if that particular person is interested in looking at some of the research models I use, happy for them to contact me. So it's wendy.bunston@bigpond.com, wendy.bunston, B-U-N-S-T-O-N, at bigpond.com, and happy to send the sort of stuff that I looked at, because that just helps when you do the research. Is big stuff to do. Yeah,
you might get 76 emails now.
I might get 76 emails, or I might get one from that person who's wanting to find out about how to do research the infant and child led. Yeah.
Thank you, Wendy. And maybe we could
There's two more questions I think that have come up
Yes,
too.
and maybe we can add your email.
And Gayle.
And yes, to the email when I send out the recording, if that works for you.
And maybe I've got a couple of articles too, if you want, just to send out to people that are interested in this arena.
That'd be fantastic.
We haven't written our article together yet, so we'll do that. I'm not sure what it's going to be about.
It's a great
one. Might be about dog ownership.
Oh, I think everyone dog ownership.
Yeah.
Toy poodles probably in particular. Sorry, Anna, keep going.
Yes, I think we've got time for one more question, and the next question is a really great one. What can we do if people do not listen to the voice of the child? How do we advocate for them, for children? When
people being the carer or other professionals, very quickly, I'd say for other professionals, particularly around care meetings and child protection meetings, I think we should either invite the infant into the space where they're being talked about, because I think that actually makes professionals sometimes behave. If not that, to bring their photo into the space and be able to keep going back to if Johnny was in the space now with us, hearing us talk about what we reckon should happen for his life, what do you reckon he'd tell us about what he reckons should happen for his life? So constantly coming back to bringing the child and the infant into the space and holding us accountable as adults and professionals who sometimes don't behave very well, bringing us into a way that's accountable to that infant and to that child. And if we were to meet this little fella in 15 years' time, will he come and say to us, you did a good job for me? Or would he say, I don't think you were thinking about me?
And, I think a lot of the time that happens because of anxiety, that it's out of professionals' comfort zones to shift their thinking, because it's it's a different way of thinking, and it's just people aren't used to it. So my recommendation or feedback would be find yourself a good supervisor, like get someone that equally prioritizes children and young people or infants, so you continue to advocate and fight that fight, because it can be hard. I mean, it is. So I'd say just, back yourself and have good organizational support in place.
Thank you, Wendy and Gayle. I think they're really, meaningful words to end on, and for people to go away and hopefully look further into this topic and have the motivation to deepen their practice in this area. As I mentioned, this is the first of a 3-part webinar series. So I'm just popping into the chat now the link where you can register for the Centre for Excellence Sector Buzz, just to keep an eye out for details of the subsequent two webinars. Will be emailed out through the Sector Buzz mailing list, as well as other avenues. So I'd just like to thank you again, Wendy and Gayle. This has really been, I think, such a valuable session and given me so much to think about, and hopefully everyone feels the same. It's such an important topic. And Wendy, I think, thinking about what that child will come back and say down the track around how we kept them in mind and in view and considered them as a person is, as you said, why we're doing the work that we are.
And can I end with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land too, which I didn't do at the beginning, but I very much like to acknowledge that and the part my family probably played in the dispossession of the First Nations of this country. Don't know what it is, but I've been here 4th generation, so I'm sure there'd be something. So. And goodbye from Coco, who's just gone out.
We've got some thank yous from audience members in the chat too. So thank you again, Wendy and Gayle, and thanks to everyone who attended today.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers.